This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Wednesday's programming, we begin with K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen. He joins us for a conversation on tax implications in cases of property easement. Also ahead, sharing their recent study abroad trip to Ireland, are K-State Ag Communications and Ag Education students Corley, Becker, and Josey, Mestagh. They, along with K-State professor and Communications and Agricultural Education Department head, Dr. Jason Ellis, explain how impactful study abroad experiences can be for students in agriculture. We end with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where K-State experts Brad White and Dustin Pendell are joined by Executive Director of U.S. CattleTrace, Callahan Grund. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Roger McEowen. He is our K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor that joins us for our Ag Law Update. And this week we're going to be talking through property easement and sort of the tax issues around easement payments. So, Roger, let's kind of start with when we see cases of easement, what do we really need to think of going through that process?
It's a big issue for rural landowners. There are a lot of easements that companies are seeking across agricultural land, whether it's to move oil, whether it's to move other types of energy, such as a transmission line for electric energy, or whether it is a carbon pipeline where we're moving carbon from one area to store in another area. And these often go from one corner of the state to the other corner of the state and crosses a lot of farm owners' land. And so that raises questions because the landowners are going to get paid for these rights that they're giving up, such as the right to lay pipeline or construct a wind tower or the associated roads or electric lines, and to give access to be able to do these types of things. So the question is, I think the starting point is, what's the character of these payments that our farmers are receiving? So what's the character of the transaction?
Absolutely. And this is going to be part one of this conversation. We'll continue this conversation in a part two later this month. But characterizing the transaction, like you said, is key here. So what that means really, I guess, in this case is it a sale or an exchange? And what does that really matter in this situation? Well,
that's right. Like trigger recognition, they could be partially offset or completely offset by the recipient's income tax basis in the land that the easement impacts. Or a sale of the property could be involved. You could also have payments for crop damage that is involved in the transaction. But a sale or exchange triggers gain or loss for income tax purposes. And so the question is whether the grant of an easement is a taxable event. The answer to that is that it depends. When a landowner grants an easement, it amounts to a sale of the land if the only thing that the landowner has after they make the grant is just bare legal title to the land. If they have conveyed all the other interest in the property away, just retaining legal title, then that amounts to a sale. And then the question is, in terms of reporting that, can I offset that income with any of my basis in the land that is actually impacted by the easement? And if so, I might be able to offset part or even all of that income as it comes in.
Absolutely. And there's several cases that you wrote through as examples of that sort of thing in an article recently that you wrote for your blog. And one of them was kind of the air rights over property.
Interesting case, the air rights case. We see this also with various types of government conservation programs and mitigation banking. And these are the conservation easements. And so if I'm granting, for example, a perpetual conservation easement in exchange for mitigation banking credits, which is one of the popular programs that's out there, then how do you treat that? Well, the IRS is going to come in and say that that's a sale or exchange. And in one instance, that's the position that the IRS held in a private letter ruling. And then the buyer of the mitigation credits, I think, is likely to be a dealer that won't hold those credits very long. And so they're likely to not have capital gain status on the sale. But the ultimate answer to the question of the buyer's tax status is going to be a fact-dependent determination. But you're right. We see this with air rights. And this is a very old case back in the 1950s. I guess it depends on what your context is in terms of very old. But what that was the grant of an easement for air rights over property that joined an air base that caused the property to be rendered useless, and that was deemed to be a sale. And then we get the grants of perpetual easements to construct a highway, for example. That's held to have been a sale. And talked about the perpetual conservation easement on property in exchange for mitigating credits. So this issue comes up in lots of contexts.
Absolutely. So that's our first step in understanding where we stand tax-wise with these easement payments, if it's a sale or exchange. But it's also important to understand if it's considered an ordinary income or capital gain. So let's talk through the differences there.
Yeah, if the payments have an basically rents for the land use, then that's going to be ordinary income in the recipient's hands. If it's a sale, then it's going to be capital gain. So that's going to be the dividing line right there. If I have conveyed all my interest in the property and the only thing that I retain, as I mentioned earlier, is just what we call bare naked legal title, then that's going to be a sale. That's going to generate capital gain. Then the question is going to be basis offset. If it basically is a lease of the property for a stated term, that's going to be ordinary income. We're going to report that as such on the return.
Key to know for sure. And then, of course, with easements, there's also different types of easements in terms of how the transactions actually take place. So with limited easements, when you grant that, what does that really include?
Well, it's in essence all of the rights and the land that are impacted by the easement. And then we would take the proceeds that are received and first apply them to reduce the basis in the land that's impacted. So, in other words, if I have income tax basis in the land that's impacted, then I'm going to offset that payment by that basis. And then I'll end up with a reduced basis in the land so that if I then later sell the land, I'm going to have more gain later on because I'll have less income tax basis at that point in time to offset the selling price. So if a grant of an easement deprives the taxpayer, again, this is the emphasis point, of practically all of the beneficial interest in the land except for just retention of legal title, then that's a sale of the land that the easement covers. So your gain or loss is going to be computed in the same manner that you would compute gain or loss on the sale of the land itself.
Absolutely. And then this is something that I didn't even think of, but the location of the easement really matters in these cases. So let's talk about what happens when an entire property is pretty much impacted by some of these easements.
Well, if the entire property is easement, that's probably going to be the minority situation when we look at these easements. Then that's a good thing from the landowner standpoint because that means that I've got a good argument that I can use my entire basis in my entire farm to offset the payments that I receive. But that's, again, I think a limited scenario when we look at all of these across the board. The location of the easement is often in a place where it doesn't disrupt your entire use of the farm. They're either going to run it down a fence line or they're going to run it across a corner of your property to try to minimize the impact on the overall farming operation. And in that instance, you only get a basis offset associated with the land that is directly impacted by the easement. Now, there are situations where, for example, if I'm running a dairy operation and this is an electric transmission line, that may throw off stray voltage that impacts my entire dairy. So even though the location may be designed to minimize impact, it also can depend on the type of the farming operation. So a dairy, that's got special considerations when it comes to electric transmission lines and the issue of stray voltage. But location is an issue. But I would emphasize that whether an easement impacts the entire parcel is a fact question. That is going to be different depending upon the facts and circumstances of each situation.
These severance damages that can be paid to compensate landowners, what does that really include in terms of the value?
Yeah, severance damages might be, and those are done to compensate the landowner for the lower value of the part of the property that's not subject to the easement. Because, again, it's you may have kind of this issue depending upon the type of easement, the type of line that's coming through, where, it directly impacts some property, but there's an indirect impact on the rest of the farm. And so a company may say, okay, we recognize we've lowered the value of the remainder part of your farm that's not directly impacted, so they make a payment for that. That's what a severance damage payment is. And if that exceeds the landowner's basis in the property, but is not subject to the easement, then gain is recognized in that situation. But
Sure.
again, that's a fact question.
That example of, a dairy farm, a good example there in that case as well. And Roger, like I said, this is going to be part one of this series where we talk about different types of easements and the ways that they affect landowners and tax things and that sort of nature. But if listeners are looking for more information on this specifically, where can they find that at?
On my website, and that's washburnlaw.edu/Walter. And then down the homepage on the left side, they can access that. They're also posted to KSU's Ag Manager website.
We'll continue this conversation in our next segment in several weeks. But in part two of that series, we're going to break down the various types of payments that landowners can receive for easements and proper reporting of those payments. So listeners, stay tuned for that for sure. But as always, Roger, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Samantha.
Once again, that was K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen speaking towards issues associated with easement payments. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, you'll be hearing from K-State Ag Communications and Ag Education students about their recent study abroad trip to Ireland. The faculty-led trip was led by their department head, Dr. Jason Ellis. He'll share why he believes these trips are impactful for students. Later on, we'll also hear from the experts at the Beef Cattle Institute for their Ask the Expert segment this week. This week, they're discussing value added from tagging calves. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Ag Today intern Katie Figge. Joining me in studio today is K-State professor and department head in communications and agriculture education, Dr. Jason Ellis, K-State student in agricultural communications, Josey Mestagh, and K-State student in agriculture education, Corley Becker. And today they will be speaking with us about their study abroad experience in Ireland. So thank you all for joining us today.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us.
So in terms of getting all the facts right off the bat, when did this study abroad take place and how many students went, and also how many places did you even go?
So the study abroad took place from November 18th through November 27th this year, so during our fall break and over the Thanksgiving holiday. We went into Ireland and we went to about 15 different places. We were in about 5 major cities. We did 3 farm tours. We did some industry stops within the city of Dublin itself. And then also we visited some of the major cultural sites that Ireland is also known for to get a better understanding of what the country is and what the people are like.
Wow, that's incredible. So Josey and Corley, what made you decide to go to Ireland?
I think what made me decide was seeing such a wonderful opportunity to not only expand my knowledge about agriculture in a different space, but also to visit a separate country.
Ireland has always been on the top of my bucket list, having it as an opportunity within the department, and being an ag ed major, there was a lot of benefits to it, and getting to know other ag communication students as well.
That's fantastic. So we found out the students why, but Dr. Ellis, this has been your 7th time taking students on a study abroad experience. Can you tell us why you continue to do it?
Taking students on study abroad experiences is a tremendous opportunity for me to be able to introduce the students to the international perspective, to give them an understanding of how United States, U.S. politics, and U.S. agriculture influences agriculture and markets and the economies around the world. It also gives me a chance to open those doors to students in a somewhat protected, safe manner in which they can go, they can travel. It's coordinated. We have the tours set up. We have the sites arranged. So it takes some of the stress and the pressures off of the students and gives them that level of comfort to be able to more easily go internationally and expand beyond their comfort zone. Another thing I appreciate about taking students on study abroad tours is that it brings back that global perspective and allows these students to be able to connect and enrich the opportunities and experiences in the classroom and in other activities that they're engaging with their students back here on campus with.
Absolutely. So, Josey and Corley, what were your favorite parts of the study abroad?
I would say that my favorite parts were all of the farm tours, but specifically we went to the Barry Stevens farm, and they had sheep, cattle, and potato production. It was very interesting. It was very much a family operation. They were very entertaining and excited to see us, and they just loved talking to us and showing us every little part of their operation and really encouraged questions for us to get to know them and them to get to know us. So that was a really, really cool experience.
I would agree with Corley there. My favorite were the farm tours as well. I did enjoy the Barry Stevens farm, but I also enjoyed the Olivia Hines farm, where we were able to learn about how she produces as a woman in ag and primarily runs it by herself. So that was really interesting to learn about and see the differences between what they do there. Specifically, she has sheep and cattle and versus what we do here.
That's awesome. So you both talked about that your favorite parts were the agricultural experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about the biggest agricultural takeaway from this experience?
I would say seeing it from a global perspective, and since they are on an island, it's a much smaller scale and definitely not near as big as the United States. So that's very interesting on how they work with imports and exports and just how the country has to operate as a whole. It was just really cool to see the upper parts of it, but also coming down to a producer level and seeing how they run it on the day-to-day.
Fantastic. Josey, anything to add to that?
I would agree with Corley that it was really interesting to see it from the global perspective, and it was also cool to see how each producer does things a little bit different, but they are all still very in tune with trying to be sustainable with how they produce all of their animals and all of their crops.
Fantastic. So, Josey and Corley, why do you feel that it's important for these students in ag communications and ag ed to take these study abroad experiences?
Well, for me and for other ag communication students, you need to know what you're teaching about, what you are marketing. And while we are in the United States, you need to know what's going on outside of them as well so you can understand how certain things work. And it's always a great way to see what other people are doing and how they are experimenting and moving forward with technology.
Yeah, and for an ag education student, I think it's really important to see how things operate on a different scale and something that might be completely different from you. So we kind of talked to some of the producers and their nieces or nephews or children, they call it secondary school there, and how that kind of operates and what ag looks like for them.
So switching gears here, Dr. Ellis, can you tell me about the class that is associated with this study abroad experience?
So in the fall semester prior to leaving for our trip during the fall break, we meet about every other week, and we work on topics related to understanding kind of the basics of the agricultural industry in Ireland, production practices, primary products of either animal origin or crop production. We also get an introduction to some of the different cultural components of Ireland, the history, its relationship to the European Union, a little bit on the government and politics of the country as well, just to give the students a foundation going in so as they engage in conversations on the industry stops, as we visit the various cultural locations and other aspects on that, as well as engaging with communications or conversations with the farmers and other agriculturists in the country. They have a foundation to be able to build off of in their questioning and conversations and their understanding of the country as a whole, how it operates and how it engages on a regional and as well as a global perspective.
So Josey and Corley, I know that part of the class is completing a project at the end. Can you tell us a little about each of your projects?
So I decided to do mine over dairy production. Our first farm stop was a dairy farm, Glenstall Farms. They were really, really educational and interesting. It's ran by a husband and wife, and then they bring in a lot of part-time workers from other countries. So they had Laura there. She was from France, and so they stay for about 3 months, and then they just learn the language. They learn more about dairy production and what they do, and so that was a very educational experience for them. But translating into my project, I just took notes on just about everything he said, like furiously writing stuff down, and that was what is going to be produced into what I'm going to make into a newsletter. So I was very attracted to like colors and pictures and something that you can show people, but give them a lot of information on what dairy production is like in Ireland.
Very cool. Josey?
So there was a lot of interesting things that we could pick from, whether it was history in Ireland to the dairy farm tours. And so I picked the Irish stud gardens because of the history behind it, where they sold their farm during World War I and used the horses as war horses and to breed for more horses, and then also sold it back to them. And they now not only have it as a tourist attraction where people can go and see, they also provide the studs for anybody that wants to come in and have their mares bred to them. They also provide an opportunity for students in different countries to come in and work with them for 6 months and just learn all the different aspects of taking care of horses, anywhere from farrier to vet to foaling out. And so that really attracted me, and I really wanted to create a short little video that just markets what their business is.
Obviously, you guys learned a lot, and it sounds like you had a lot of good fun. But what is some advice that you would give other students considering a study abroad experience?
I would say to definitely just take the chance and do it. You're not going to get that opportunity again, and even if it scares you or you're worried about something, there's things that you can do to help out with your financials and getting there. And so I would definitely just take your chance, go do it. You won't get the opportunity again, and it's going to teach you way more than you even think it will.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, that you're never going to have quite this opportunity again. I think the beauty of a faculty-led study abroad is that you don't have to worry about hardly anything. You have to worry about getting yourself and your stuff there, and that's about it. And Dr. Ellis was great about getting us to where we needed to be. We really didn't have to worry about anything because we knew that they were going to get us from point A to point B. So that's just kind of such a peace of mind for us, and definitely a experience that was definitely worthwhile, and I would recommend over and over again.
Yeah, you definitely have to worry about that 50-pound weight limit on your feet.
That's for sure.
So, Dr. Ellis, where can listeners find more information about study abroad experiences through K-State?
The primary location for information on the variety of international student opportunities at K-State is through an office called the Education Abroad Office. And they can find that online at k-state.edu/abroad. And that office coordinates a variety of different opportunities, whether it be the programs that we're talking about today, the faculty-led study tours, which usually range from about a week to 2 weeks in duration, up to a semester or even year-long study abroad experience where the student exchanges or goes to an international university and takes courses, participates in other learning activities. More specifically, if listeners or others that are interested in programs related to agriculture or through the College of Agriculture here at K-State, they can start with the College of Agriculture Academic Programs Office, which is located in Waters Hall. And through the Associate Dean for Academic Programs, Dr. Dan Mosier, would be a great contact to start to identifying agricultural-oriented programs specifically.
Awesome. And as always, the link to that information can be found in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. Thank you all for coming in today and talking about your study abroad experience to Ireland.
Thank you.
So once again, that was K-State professor and department head in communications and agricultural education, Dr. Jason Ellis, K-State student in agricultural communications, Josey Mestagh, and K-State student in agriculture education, Corley Becker, with information on their study abroad experience in Ireland. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. We're back now for this week's edition of the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. We're joined by K-State experts Brad White and Dustin Pendell, as well as Executive Director of U.S. CattleTrace, Callahan Grund.
Welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White, happy to have a couple experts with me today. Dr. Dustin Pendell, who works here in Ag Econ.
Hello, Brad.
And Callahan Grund, who's the Executive Director of U.S. CattleTrace.
Hi, Brad.
So we have a question from a listener, and as always, if you want to send in a question, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu, and our experts get a chance to answer that question, and they'll get up to 10 points based on their answers. So, Dustin, I'm going to turn to you first. Our question for today is from a listener that asked, does it pay to tag my calves?
And I'm going to give you an answer that you don't like, and that's it depends. It's yes and no. Yes, as a producer, I will use the information from the tag in making my own farm management records, using that information to make decisions on my own operation. No, it's not necessarily going to get me a premium when I take the calves to the auction, I think. So that's my answers, yes and no.
Okay, yes and no. Doesn't really help me, so I'm not going to give a lot of points for that. You can make up in the second round, but right now you're sitting at 4. Callahan, does it pay to tag my calves?
Well, I'm not an economist by trade, so I can say yes and definitively say yes to it. But to Dustin's point there, I think it does, it does help in terms of the management decisions and how you can utilize it on your operation. And it can also be part of programs to do the things associated with that ear tag that do pay when you move on to those whether it's a feeder cattle marketing program. There's a lot of good ones out there like that. I don't want to discriminate against any of those. But tagging those cattle, you can not only on your own operation, maybe the absence of the premium there that you get associated with that tag, make better decisions to increase profitability on your operation. But on the other side of it, there are some programs out there where you tag your cattle, whether it's a VAC 45 program, whether it's a genetic program that you're a part of. Some of those opportunities of tagging that cattle, that tag is associated with the management practices that you did that can increase the profitability of those animals.
Excellent. So Dustin, I'm going to turn back to you. And as a follow-up question, we'll go on the yes side. What are some of the potential opportunities if I tag my calves?
So some of the opportunities, so I visited with the producer, there's a sheep producer, not cattle, but he had, I want to say like 10, 20,000 ewes that he'd bring down out of the mountains in the Rockies. And they had tags, and he would use it specifically when he wanted to cull the ram. So he would actually get all the carcass data back, and he would then say, okay, he would tie those to the certain rams, and he said from a quality, from a carcass standpoint, that's how they made their decisions on which rams to cull and which rams to keep.
So you got to have those tags to get that
data.
data.
The tags, and then you need to work out kind of an agreement with the feedlot and with the packer to get that data back to you. So that's just one example. A second example, visit with a cattle producer in Canada. They would record anytime with vaccinations, anything. So then when they sent it on to the feedlot, they had that information. And I think they were actually getting a premium because they were part of a program. And so there are examples of when you could for sure use this to make money, get a premium.
But it's not just a sales premium. It is you're using the data to make better decisions, and that's where you actually get paid.
Exactly. Yep.
So 2 concrete examples and a good place to use some of those tags puts you back in the lead with your 8 to Callahan's 7. Callahan?
I think to that point, though, as well, those cattle are worth more in some of those situations because they have done the extra steps needed on their operation to do that. And as we look at progressing the whole cattle industry forward into producing, we currently produce the highest quality, best tasting, safest product in the whole world. But as we continue to make that so much more uniform across the industry, those practices are really important. And, we've talked about before historically, ID is really a core component of measuring anything as you look at that across that opportunity. So it does pay in terms of, measuring that, to Dustin's point, to really move the profitability line for your operation moving forward.
Excellent answer. And believe it or not, Dustin, Callahan just snuck past you, ended up with 9 to your 8. And I think the point here is ID. And Dustin, I'm going to go back to, I gave you grief about it, but you're absolutely right. There are times that it will pay and there are times that it won't. Figure it out for your operation. Find out what fits and how it can fit in on your operation. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you guys answering that listener question. And as always, if you have questions, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, those were K-State experts Brad White and Dustin Pendell, as well as Callahan Grund, the Executive Director of U.S. CattleTrace. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.